It means actively opening yourself to possibilities that are excluded by your current way of thinking. And as I sometimes say, a gardener can't make a plant. A gardener has to take the possibility of a plant and encourage it or thwart it. And I think that's the way it is. You have to stop thwarting things happening in your consciousness, in your personal life, and take away the blocks and see what comes. It won't be done by an effort. It will be done because you have stood back. If you really want a plan of action, it would be things like make time for mindfulness, which is simply stopping the chatter in your left hemisphere, which is going on all the time. Yes, I know, I've got it, I understand. No, stop all that and see what comes forward.
Dr. Iain McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, philosopher, and a literary scholar. He's the Quondam Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, and he's also the author of a number of books, best known possibly for his bestseller The Master and His Emissary, and his 2-volume magnum opus, The Matter of Things, which deals with our brains, our delusions, and the unmaking of the world. So, Iain McGilchrist, thank you very much for joining me today.
No, thank you very much for having me along.
This is a remarkable work, Iain, and you've had it produced in beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful books I've come across. It's very high quality paper, very good bindings. It's beautifully presented as well. But more than that, it's the scholarship that's behind it, and the writing is clear, and you can dip into it almost anywhere. How did you come to write this book, and what is it centrally about?
Well, I came to write it almost by accident, in the sense that I had a contract to write a shorter version of The Master and His Emissary. Ho, ho. And it turned into something else, a much longer book than The Master and His Emissary. But I realised that there was very little in it for me to just say crudely things I'd said more subtly at length, if people were going to take that version. So instead, I've all my life really, I've been I'm excited by ideas since I was a child, and I suppose in a way I'm a philosopher, and I was interested in what is the truth, as we all are, and as philosophers must be. And the problem is that if the two hemispheres of the brain, as I have argued, bring into being for us two versions of the world that have quite different qualities and are superficially incompatible, how are we to know what the truth is? And so the book falls into 3 parts. In the first part, I look at, in greater depth than I did in The Master and His Emissary, at the real differences between the two hemispheres, and in particular in relation to their veracity, their ability to report truthfully on reality. And I suggest that in the 8 ways in which we can have a handle on the world, in which we get a portal into the world, in 7 of those routes, the right hemisphere is superior to the left. The only one the left is superior at is in grasping things, getting things, penning them down and having them, possessing them, having power over them. But when it comes to...
remind us, sorry, of the eight ways in which we have some connection to...
Okay, well, I took those to be attention, and that is central to the thesis of all my work, because it turned out very early on that the key difference between the hemispheres was certainly not in their doing different things, because they all do everything, but it was in the way in which they did it, and that way is based on the attention they pay to the world. And the left hemisphere pays narrow beam attention to an already known and desired detail and goes out and gets it, and for that it needs very precisely targeted attention to a very small thing, whereas the right hemisphere has this broad, open, sustained vigilance for everything else. And so it wouldn't be odd if the right hemisphere saw more than the left, because evolutionarily that is the way they've developed. And so the first is attention, and there's no question that the right hemisphere attends to a much broader picture, and therefore the next thing perceives better. So in all 5 of the main sensory modalities, the right hemisphere is superior to the left in perception. And then in forming judgments on the basis of what has been attended to and perceived, the right hemisphere is very much superior. So in the bad old days, when there was a lot of pop psychology talk about hemisphere differences, it was said that the left hemisphere was a bit dull, but at least down to earth and reliable. But in fact, it's not. It's not reliable. And the left hemisphere is a very poor guide to reality. In fact, it is frankly deluded unless the right hemisphere is supervising it. And that's not, I'm not, first of all, using that word in a casual way. I mean, from a psychiatric point of view, the left hemisphere is prone to delusion massively. And I look at some 25 syndromes in that book in which neuropsychiatric syndromes in which delusions, extraordinary delusions, predominate, and in all but one of them, it's largely dependent on damage to the right hemisphere, not to the left. So there's attention, perception, and judgment. And then there is what I call apprehension, and this is the one the left hemisphere is good at, grasping onto things and pinning them down. But as I point out, the right hemisphere, it doesn't so much apprehend as comprehend. So it sees, and comprehend literally means to take together. So it sees the picture in the round. And then there is the 2 main kinds of intelligence, emotional and social intelligence on the one hand, and cognitive intelligence, in other words, what we measure by IQ, on the other. And in both of those, the right hemisphere is superior to the left. And finally, there's creativity, which is, it is involved, I'm afraid, whether you like it or not, in our ability to take in information from the world, because there is a vast sea of information. And the brain has to be able to see, I see how this works. And that is a slight creative leap. We're not aware of doing it. We do it all the time in order to make sense of the world. So in all those respects, apart from the apprehension, the grasping and having power over, the right hemisphere is superior to the left. And then in the second part of the book, I look at what I call the main pathways to truth. So when we've got our insights into what's going on in the world, what paths do we follow? And I reckon fairly uncontroversially that 2 of these are science and reason, and that perhaps these days not so much observed, but very, very important, in fact more important than anything, are intuition and imagination. And each of these pathways has its limitations. Science and reason do, and intuition and imagination do, but they also have their particular strengths, and we can't do without any of them. And then in the last part of the book, this is really, metaphysics or ontology. It's really, so when we come with what we've gathered so far in the book to look at the world, what kind of a world do we find? And I think we find a world very different from the one that's peddled by pop science these days, and people think has the backing of science, but actually doesn't.
So with that kind of lens to focus our attention through at the world around us, how much of reality do we actually really experience? And have we got any proper grasp of what reality is? Or is it all merely perception, which is quite divorced from reality?
It's a very profound and interesting question. And I do have a view on that. In a way, of course, there cannot be knowledge of whatever reality is without the person with the knowledge entering into it. So the observer is always part of the picture. And I liken this to that we don't just find knowledge, as it were, and find truth somewhere out there, but nor do we make it up. There's a horrible toxic thing that's happened in our culture in the last, pretty much a century now. There is no truth, we make it all up, a kind of deconstructive postmodernism. And I very much reject that. On the other hand, I also reject a naive realist position that there just is truth and get on with it, and it exists apart from being observed. I don't think that can be the case. I'm not here relying on physics, although physics would probably, you could tell me whether it would in fact support that position. But I see it as an encounter. So there is something within me that is the consciousness that comes to attend, and there is whatever there is out there. And these two things are not entirely separate. But in everything that we know comes out of an encounter, the encounter with whatever it is that we think of as in here and whatever it is we think of as being out there. And in that encounter, both parties take part and both parties are somewhat changed. And so the way in which we attend to reality and what we think we find there changes what it is that we know and that anyone can know about reality. And I agree that we can't have, if it would, a sort of a Platonic vision. We can't have a sort of vision of the absolute truth anywhere. But that doesn't mean that some things are not truer than others. And that comes from experience. So as William James, a great hero of mine, said, if you tend to believe things as are true, you will find yourself caught out less often by experience. And that's quite a good pragmatic way of thinking of it. And if you believe rather delusional things, then you will find that you are caught out, that it just doesn't really stand up. So I just want to...
Are you saying...
Can I quickly just make one further point, which is that there are two ways of thinking of our partial knowledge. One is that we only get so far towards reality and then we have to stop, so that really we're still inside our own projections. And the other is that we do actually pick up something that is real, but we can only pick up what it is we can see from our vantage point. And it's partial in that sense, that it's only a part of the truth. And I espouse that second position, not the first. In as much as it can mean anything, I think that
the Pauline position, I see through a glass darkly. In other words, in partial terms. Is that?
Yes, that is right. Although there's a possibility there for mistaking it, and in that saying that the glass darkly is actually that what you see is too much like a representation made up by us inside our heads. And of course, in essence, what we see is bound to have something of us, our past experience, our imagination, whatever, goes into whatever it is that we take to be real. But I want to get away from the idea which is latent in Donald Hoffman's work. He's written a book called The Case Against Reality.
I was going to talk to you about Donald Hoffman. Yeah, go ahead.
No, well, let's. I mean, I think the point there is that he sees us rather like homunculi inside a cell with no windows, and what we see is just a projection on the walls of the cell. He talks, in fact, about a readout of dials. And here I take a more Whiteheadian view that it's not just reading out of dials, but we are really in contact with something that is real. It's not just a cerebral image or chimera. It's something that comes out of the whole business of embodied experience. You know, and Whitehead said, you know, which is true, that when you see a sunset, there are certain wavelengths of light and all that. That is true. But it's also absolutely true that you do see this amazingly beautiful experience of redness in the sky. And that is not imaginary in some way. It is at least as real as the scientific way of thinking. They're just two different ways of approaching it.
Yes, reductionists would say that second view, the beauty of the sunset, is non-existent. You've just made it up, and it only reduces down to that. But let me go back to Donald Hoffman, if I may, because I had a chance to chat with him on an interview a couple of weeks back, and he, whereas you take, I think, your starting point that there is a way of viewing reality from the point of view that the two hemispheres of the brain have a different take on the matter. He takes a slightly different starting point, but comes to, I thought, a similar conclusion. But his starting point is, look, we are the products of evolution. And evolution selects for survival. It does not select for our understanding of the truth. It does not select for our understanding of reality. It only selects for survival. And from that point of view, we therefore have to simplify the world, and therefore we never come to a full understanding of reality, because why should we? We're not designed that way by evolution. And instead, he says that the model we should be looking at is that of a desktop on a computer, that what we see basically around us, we interpret everything as like an icon for a file, or an icon for a folder. And what we don't see is the reality of the transistors, the chips, the electric current, which is really what the computer is. And he said, if we had to deal with reality, we could never write an essay on a word processor. We have to deal with icons at a much lower resolution level, which we have constructed ourselves in order to cope with the world that we live in.
Well, there's a lot to say about that, but the one that immediately springs to mind is there's a sort of parallel here with language. So language is a set of symbols at one level in which we encode information about the world and are able to pass it to other people. So language is an image of the world, if you like, in a certain respect. But I would strongly argue that language is deeply limited in what it can actually tell us about reality, and that we know and experience realities that go well beyond anything that is properly expressible in language. If we try to express it in language, we fall short of what it is that we are trying to describe. And obvious examples are things like love, God, music. All these things are not irrational, but if you think you've encompassed them in language, you've got them wrong. So that's one thing I'd say. But another is, I don't think the story that it's all about survival is quite right. Of course, first of all, at a Darwinian level, it is true that competition comes into evolution, but so does cooperation, and species that do well cooperate with one another. So it's not just a barbarian sort of thing that you get only what is useful for survival. Well, you could say that cooperation is useful for survival, so that's not a real problem for Donald. But I think
I was going to say, I think his comment is a bit deeper than that. It's not cooperation, but perception itself.
Yes,
it's not about
that's right.
Truth. It's about having kids, to quote him.
Yes, I sort of get that, but then he's got to explain why life evolved from actinobacteria, some examples of which go on multiplying, living for 1 million years. So that is quite extraordinary, that there are bacteria at the base of the ocean that do that whole job anciently and perfectly. So why have things been drawn to something more complex? Yes. And I think that's a good point, because I'm jumping ahead a bit here, and there's about 1,000 pages I'm skipping over, but I think that in essence, we don't make up either a sense of purpose in order to cheer ourselves up, nor do we make up the values of the good, the true, and the beautiful, the Platonic virtues. I think that these things pre-exist us, and that we recognize them rather than invent them. And of course, we may fail to recognize them, and a lot of people nowadays do. But I think that they're real, and I think they are lures, and I think they ask us to go in a certain direction. To go sideways a little at the moment, I'm collaborating with a group of people around the work of Mike Levin, who's a developmental biologist, who has worked on the way in which an embryo will develop around a block. So if you block its development in the way that it's programmed to develop, it won't just go on blindly pushing at the wall. It will find a clever way to get round it and carry on towards the goal that it feels it's attracted to. And there are many, many examples in biology. This is incontrovertible. So what I think we have to accept there is that there are things that call us from in front as well as things that push us from behind. And Donald's model is, I think, essentially a mechanistic model, that it allows you, you're pushed for something, and if it doesn't go, you choose the path that will help you survive. But I think that more than that, we are programmed to go towards things that are good and beautiful and true. And to cut to the chase, I think that the divine ground of being is such that it requires free, independent beings that are therefore not just puppets, but that can resonate with the true, the good, and the beautiful. And evolution has cut our survival very, very severely. I mean, even a tree can last 1,000 years, but not us. So, but I think the payoff is that, yes, okay, a shrew may be able to, and a bird may be able to respond to beauty in certain ways, but I think that we have a bigger capacity to do so, and certainly for the true and the good. And that is what we're here for, actually, not for just surviving pointlessly. What's the point in surviving if there's no further point? You know, it just kicks the can down the road. Why survive unless there's something to survive for?
Okay, let me ask you then about these qualities or these eternal verities, truth and goodness and beauty. Where do they originate from, and how do we have an intuitive grasp of them? Is this some kind of Kantian a priori knowledge which is built into human beings, that we will grasp after certain things because we have an intuitive understanding of them?
Well, you're asking all the best questions. I don't know about a Kantian...
I mean, the most difficult questions.
Well, yes, but I think they're the right questions, and I think they're revealing questions. So, first I should make a distinction between the idea of making up truth, beauty, and goodness, and the idea of making up what we here and now in this culture at this moment in time conceive to be good, true, or beautiful. Now, those things are, to a certain extent, those latter things are going to be influenced certainly by culture. But we don't, nonetheless, there always is a true, a good, and a beautiful. And so if you are an Amazonian tribe, you also have an idea of the true and the good and the beautiful, although what you consider to be true and good and beautiful may be different. But I would also caution, not as different as people want to make out, because they want to make out that we make everything up. The culture is rather against the idea that there are, as it were, eternally rooted, and perhaps not eternally, but deeply rooted, profoundly persistent, I keep calling them lures, although it's a rather horrible word, but I don't really know quite what else to put in it. Ideals or something of that kind.
Yes.
Because, for example, it's very obvious that there are many cross-cultural, mostly very good cross-cultural agreements on what is good and bad and what is beautiful and so on. So you can always point to Rubens's women and say, well, that was a special taste at a certain time. But there are so many instances, and I won't waste time going into them, but I've gone into some of them in my work that show that they're not like that. And the other thing is that, to answer your question about it being innate, it must be innate, because within the first 72 hours of birth, first 72 hours after birth, an infant can fixate on a human face. It's orientated itself enough to do that, and it will preferentially fixate on a beautiful face. And by that, it may be beautiful in the culture of the parents, but it might be not. So faces that are considered widely beautiful by people across different cultures, the baby, without prior experience, will focus on those. So there is a sort of intrinsic idea of beauty. I'm pretty certain that exists. And it's not a coincidence that across the world, the golden ratio, the golden section, has been considered, before we were able even to describe it, has been considered intuitively beautiful. And so I think one way of talking about it, instead of talking about Kantian a priori, is to say that we do come, obviously, with both genetic and epigenetic loadings, and I think that is definitely part of it. So we know that things that happened during somebody's lifetime alter their DNA coding and may be inherited by the children, so that, for example, I mean, a very lurid but obvious example is that mice that have been taught to associate the smell of cherry blossom with an electric shock, so that they avoid it. Their offspring, who have no experience of this, when they smell the cherry blossom, will show fearful signs. So things are inherited in that way. But there's also this question.
Sounds very Lamarckian. Is that standard?
Yes, no, it is, absolutely. I mean, as so often in history, people who were poo-pooed for a long time turn out to have been onto something, but science was too rigid to accept it. And Lamarck is now rehabilitated. I hope to live long enough, and I hope he will live long enough to see Rupert Sheldrake rehabilitated, because his morphogenetic fields are, you know, hot stuff in modern biology.
Well, he was someone I was also going to ask you about, because I had a chance to chat with him too a few weeks ago, months ago. And I just
Wonderful.
wondered what you thought of his morphogenic resonance and also his panpsychism too.
Well, I share his panpsychism, although let me put it this way, we're both panpsychists. I haven't talked to him about quite what he means by panpsychist, so I'm not sure I would agree on everything, but I largely do. And I found Rupert's writing very persuasive, and he's been published in places that many scientists would give their right arm to be published in repeatedly. He is an astonishingly insightful, interesting, and empirically based scientist. I mean, he really is an astonishing person. And I think that what he perceived a long time ago was that there must be form fields that cause things to take the shapes that they do. And now that we've decoded the human genome, we know that there just isn't anywhere near enough information to provide that kind of four-dimensional detailed information. It must exist in some form. Now, what that form is another matter. Is it an electromagnetic field? What is it? I don't know. Nobody does know. But whatever it is, I would say that it is a form of consciousness, actually, which explains why it doesn't have a problem in interacting with matter, because I believe that consciousness and matter are ultimately not separate, but actually different. Well, I would say that matter is a manifestation, a way in which consciousness can manifest, that has certain qualities of resistance and persistence.
Can I ask you about consciousness? Because clearly that's an important.
We're going through all the big ones.
It's an important connection. I mean, with studies of brain function. I mean, would you say that consciousness is a product of the brain itself, or is it independent of the brain? I mean, we're conscious beings, and we attribute that to our brain functions. But is that too simplistic? Does
It
consciousness
is,
exist outside the brain?
yes. Um,
How?
and Well, a bigger question is, how does it exist in the brain? And a more important question, I can answer that one. But I just
Okay, to that one then.
want to just first say that although people have been trying for 150 years to work out how lumpen matter with nothing to do with consciousness could possibly eventuate in consciousness, and nobody has come up with an even remotely satisfying explanation of how this magic trick can be done. And so I think it's much more rational to assume that consciousness is not suddenly by a magic trick produced out of matter, but is there from the start. And I hold, and that is part of panpsychism, that the cosmos is a field of consciousness, and that everything exists in that field of consciousness, and everything has somewhat of consciousness about it. And the kind of consciousness and the extent of that consciousness has changed over evolution when it comes to individual beings. But carry on.
I was just going to say, is this connected with the degree of complexity of a system? Because the human brain is probably one of the most, if not the most complex object that we know in terms of the number of neurons,
Absolutely.
connections, and consciousness seems to reside in that. Is it connected to the complexity? Because if it
No.
is connected to complexity, then when you look at something else like a stone or a spoon, there's little complexity in that to sustain consciousness.
Yes. And complexity can't just of itself be the answer to how does consciousness come about. I think a rather telling fact is that
But necessary rather than sufficient.
no, I don't think it's either of those really, because as I say, I think consciousness pre-exists everything. I think consciousness is the ontological primitive, and
Right.
that the cosmos that we observe and think of as material is something that manifests from that consciousness, which is in its essence, if nothing else, undeniably creative. If from the start of the universe everything was just a simple lump, it has diversified and complexified into something absolutely extraordinary, which contains creatures like you and me having this conversation. So there is something about that makes sense in terms of consciousness as the ground rather than as an eventual emission. But just let's think about the brain and complexity. The cerebrum contains only 20% of the neurons in the brain. The other 80% are contained in the cerebellum, the ancient brain, at the back of the brain. Now, on its own, the cerebellum, which is massively complexly interconnected and contains cells known as Purkinje cells, which are some of the most ramified and complexly interrelated neurons in the entire brain. But the cerebellum cannot on its own sustain consciousness. The cerebrum does. Now, my view is a somewhat Bergsonian one, that the brain, well, the brain logically has to either emit consciousness, and I think I've made my point about that being untenable, or it can transmit consciousness, or it can permit consciousness, and I take it to do the last of these. So it permits consciousness in the way that the river banks are not the stream, but they permit the stream to be. If they weren't there, there wouldn't be a stream. The stream is the water. The water goes through those channels and is shaped into the river and the stream and whatever. But so I see the brain as a sort of, if you like, a valve that shapes consciousness to be my consciousness while I have it, your consciousness while you have it.
But if the brain dies, the consciousness goes.
Well, we don't know where it goes. We certainly know that the consciousness that was being expressed in that body is no longer there. There is a problem around this which I don't think I've got any kind of answer to, which is that it certainly seems that the brain can cease to function and there be a completely flatline EEG, and people can return from this and have memories. Now, of course, the question is, what is a memory? And I mean, that's one that scientists assume but cannot explain. I mean, is it really true? I mean, you know the Wilder Penfield experiment in which by stimulating the cortex in a patient during an operation, he was able to have the patient re-experience a very particular, precise memory. Now, please tell me, reductionist, how it is that a cell can produce a precise memory of an event. I don't think we know how that happens, but I think that and I haven't got an answer to it either, but I do think that it's very well worth never forgetting the limits of our understanding, because we can get carried away with how clever we are and how much we know, when in fact a more fruitful and a more scientific approach would be a more humble one. But what I'm saying is I don't know what happens to consciousness after, as it were, I die. I suspect that it's not destroyed exactly. And I use an image here which I found very helpful, which comes from Schelling, the early 19th century German, well, he's called an idealist, but I think that's too simple. But anyway, which is the image of a whirlpool or an eddy in a stream. For a while in the stream there can be such an eddy. It is very real. It can be photographed, it can be measured, it can have the power to shift stones. But the water that goes through it carries on down the river, and also eventually the eddy itself may be moved or distorted or enlarged or shrunken. So it's something that is flexible but not. It carries on having an effect down the stream, and I think that in a way, all life, and perhaps even also the inanimate world, because I used to make a hard and fast distinction between the animate and the inanimate, and I don't now make a hard and fast one. I think there's a very important one, but I don't think it's a hard and fast one. It's just an extraordinarily important matter of degree. But in any case, it's the whirlpool that I would draw attention to as the best metaphor I have.
Okay. So you've indicated that in your view, consciousness is kind of the ultimate foundational ontological primitive, the thing
Yes.
which is always there.
Yes.
And from which everything derives its being, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
Are we talking here in almost theological terms of what would constitute an image of God? I mean, do you believe in a God? And if so, how do you envisage that God to be? And is that what we've just described here from your point of view?
As I say, you go to all the very big questions. I like it. I think undoubtedly it would be wrong to say I don't believe in a God. I think it might be misleading for me to say I believe in God in the generally received sense, although not that misleading. I've been reluctant to go down that path, although I've had a very strong feeling all my life that there is a realm of something divine and sacred that I experienced very early on in contact with nature and music in particular. But I do think there is a divine ground of being, absolutely. The last chapter of the Matter with Things is entitled The Sense of the Sacred. And it cost me more to write that than anything else I've ever written, because I wanted to try and capture something that is intrinsically not captured in language, in a way that I could convey to people that, yes, outside of language, there's something here we must take seriously. And I'm very pleased to say that a lot of people have written to me saying that they have had their eyes open to the possibility, or reopened, both. So I do think there is something there, and I think it's what we can say about its nature is that I think that if I believe that consciousness is part of the features of the ground of being, then I think that God is not, as it were, exhausted by just being described as consciousness, but nonetheless all consciousness is in God. This is why I'm not a pantheist, but I'm a panentheist. In other words, I don't believe that God is just simply the sum of everything, but I believe that everything is in God and God is in everything. So God is not exhausted by accounting for all the things that we can find. So I think one can say is it conscious, and I think the other important thing to say about it is relational. And that seems to me essential. I believe, in fact, that all that exists is relata. Relationships are primary. Things come later. And I argue for that in the book, and I won't go into that unless you ask me to do so, but let me say that is my strong conviction and the conclusion of my argument. And I think that is coincident with the view in pretty much around the world wisdom traditions that God has the nature of love, and that love is, if nothing else, a matter of relation.
But would you push that further? Because, I mean, like you, I've come to the conclusion too that the fundamental things are relations between objects rather than objects which we can't know, even if they exist, but the relations can. But in this terms of some consciousness, this divine consciousness, let's call it that for the want of a term, this overarching consciousness, relationship is important, which suggests that we have some kind of relationship to that consciousness. But would you go so far as to say that kind of a consciousness has personality? It is a personal thing in order to have relationship. I mean, we talk in Christian terms, or in any of the great
Mm,
religious terms. They talk about
mm,
gods with personalities. You know,
yes, yes.
are you going as far as that to say this consciousness has this quality about it, and maybe even a personal interest, which is what most religions major on, that there is a God with a personal interest in you?
A difficult one because I can be misunderstood whatever I say, but I think that I do believe ultimately that it would be wrong to say that it was an impersonal force, like, a force in physics that we just haven't fully described. I think that to the extent that what we indicate by the personal is an interest in not just the generality, but in the unique case, I think that is what I would say. In as much that it has moral quality, I think it has. In as much as it has a response to the things that make our consciousness what it is, such as the capacity to feel, to have moral value, to attend. I think it must have these qualities, and that it's the evoking of those in us is why we are here. I mean, we come back to this question: why has evolution kicked against the second law of thermodynamics, at least for a while, to produce highly, highly complex, energy expensive organisms? And I think the only explanation for this is that they are at last capable of resonance with whatever it is that is in that ground of being. In other words, love. In other words, goodness, truth, and beauty. And so
Are you? I was going to say,
go
are
on.
you validating what most religions would say is an essential component of relationship, which is prayer? Are you validating the act of
I am.
seeking direct communion with that consciousness?
I am, but I'd have to qualify it again rather quickly. What I dislike in certain kinds of religion is the belief that God is like an engineer or a puppet master who has control over everything. And it's not a weakness in God that by an act of self limitation, he doesn't control everything. Because in order to have a free creation, there must be the capacity for whatever is created to be independent and make decisions that are not those wished by the creator. So when people evoke a God having a personal interest in the sense that if I pray for a certain outcome, it will happen, I'm doubtful about that. I think there is place for, and people may say there are examples of prayer being efficacious, but I think that is in a way a left hemisphere interpretation of prayer. It gives us power and control, but actually we must give up power and control. We must abandon it completely in the face of God. And it is not actually belief in the sense of, and the word actually means love. It is not a loving disposition towards the God that offers a loving disposition. If you make a bargain that you want things to come out your way, you have to accept that they definitely won't. And St. Francis said something rather wonderful, which is that when you pray, you must ask for nothing, nothing. And I think that's rather interesting because, when I was at school, we were taught that prayer has four, as it were, types. There is adoration, there is confession, there is thanksgiving, and there is supplication. And as a young person, I always thought that confession, because I had a strong sense of having fallen short,
Yeah.
and supplication, the asking for qualities or for whatever that one wished, was more important. But at this stage in life, I think adoration and thanksgiving are really the most important, probably the only really important parts of prayer.
Would you go so far as to put it this way, that if there is a consciousness, a larger consciousness of some kind, and our own consciousness, that I mean, you mentioned prayer is various factors to it, but when you think of probably the most famous prayer, the Lord's Prayer, which says essentially the component is "Thy will be done." In other words, The purpose then would be to align your will with the greater purpose of rather than trying to get the greater will to do what you
Correct.
want to do,
Absolutely.
and therefore becoming more in harmony with it. Can I tie that back to the question of the right and left brains then?
Sure, sure.
Does one side or the other of the hemispheres interact more so in this realm than the other? And how?
Yes, and unfortunately, I made the mistake of taking part in a program on BBC Radio 4 by Giles Fraser, in which what I had said was very much abbreviated and taken out of context, and that's always the problem if one does such a thing. But of course, anything that's absolute is not going to be right here, and I think that the whole brain is involved. But I would like to make a distinction which is most vividly made for me by Abraham Heschel, who was a 20th century rabbi, who wrote a wonderful book called Sabbath, if nothing else worth reading. But he said that in the ancient Judaic image of Yahweh, there were two important qualities that we needed to have. One was halakha and the other was agadah. And halakha is the one that makes rules and procedures and founds a kind of institutional religion. But the other, agadah, is a more mystical thing that comes from the heart or the gut or the soul, and is to do with yes, the more mystical aspects of religion. And he said that though both are required, of the two, Agadah is more important than Halakha. And I would say that very strongly. You know, the religions may need to have structures and holy books and all the rest, but they must be careful not to fall into fundamentalism and absolutism. The left hemisphere, if nothing else, likes things to be crystal clear, and it can't be both. It must be either or, whereas most profound truths are both and in their structure. In a way, Niels Bohr made that point in physics. And it's certainly one I would maintain in philosophy, that we have to hold things that are uncomfortable to hold together, both of them. The right hemisphere is better able to do that. It is better able to transcend language. It is less likely to be bound into a black and white, rule-bound situation, as it were. And it's also more attuned to things. It doesn't rule them out because it can't explain them. The left hemisphere rules out things that don't fit into its paradigm. So the right hemisphere is just more open, more attentive. It's on the lookout. I mean, evolutionarily, this is the point of the right hemisphere. It's now, what else might there be here? Whereas the left hemisphere is going, I want one of those, and one of those. I know what they are. I want to get them. That's not a good way to be if you're trying to approach a religious disposition. And there is evidence, which I give in the book. I think I can find it in an appendix, I think probably Appendix 7 at the end of Volume 2 of The Matter with Things, in which I talk about evidence that the right hemisphere is more involved in what we think of as religious experiences, and that people who meditate frequently and so on literally enlarge areas in the right hemisphere. And I give all the detail and the references there if people are at all interested. But I would be loath to go around saying it's all the right hemisphere matter and the left hemisphere doesn't come into it, because both of them in a working relationship, both of them are working together. But that harmony only comes if the left hemisphere will consent to be under the aegis of the right hemisphere. The master must have, as it were, its oversight of the hemisphere.
The way I've come to view it through reading your work is that, and I just wonder if you would agree with this or whether I've got it wrong, is that the left hemisphere is really solidly concerned with consistency, getting the consistency between things correct, whereas the right is more interested in the apprehension of what the truth, or as much of the truth as it can be. And truth and consistency are not the same things.
They're not, and that is a very, very good insight. It's exactly what I hope to have been saying. Two things really. The first is going back to Donald Hoffman. I think the left hemisphere is more like his image of sort of reading off the dials and making up a picture that's self-consistent. Whereas, if you like to extend the metaphor, the right hemisphere occupies a room in which it's got a window on the world, and they're saying, but is this really what I'm seeing through that window?
Yeah.
But the second thing is just to mention those extraordinary experiments, very briefly, that were done with people having one or other hemisphere temporarily suppressed. And they were asked about a syllogism in which one of the premises was false. And they were asked, was the conclusion correct? Was it truthful? And with the right hemisphere suppressed, the same individuals that had said with the left hemisphere suppressed and in the normal state can't be right, they would say, yes, it is right. And when challenged, they say, but don't you know that, as it were, a porcupine is not actually a monkey? They would say, well, that's what it says here on the piece of paper. So the same person's brain, in two sets of circumstances, prefers a kind of keep the model that I've got internally consistent.
Does this explain the real essential problem in something like quantum mechanics? Because you mentioned Niels Bohr earlier on, but typically, I mean, on a simple level, quantum mechanics presents you with two separate pictures here of a particle. The particle is either, there's a particular description that you can have of an electron as a particle, and then you can see the same picture but as a wave this time.
Sure,
now, these two things are almost incompatible, but the truth of those two things is indisputable. The electron is a particle and it is a wave. But when you feed that from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, it's demanding consistency and cannot get it.
No. Well, the left hemisphere is you can go sort of does not compute, whereas the right hemisphere is expert at doing the most important thing of holding two things that seem incompatible together for a while, seeing what fruitful comes out of it. That's a whole other topic. It's a very important one, that's being able to hold two things together, the coincidence of opposites. I have a chapter on that.
Yes, you say that essentially the deeper truths contain often conflicting, or what the left brain might consider as conflicting ideas, but they have to be held together.
Well, that's exactly what Niels Bohr said, that the opposite of a deep truth is often another deep truth. Obviously, the shallow truth or a simple complementarity. Yeah. And as you know, when he was ennobled by the Danish crown, he took the image of the Taijitu as his symbol, the yin-yang symbol. Yeah. What I quite like is, I'm a believer in as much as I'm not a physicist, but I'm very interested in quantum field theory, and the idea that a field can be collapsed to a particle under certain circumstances, but that generally speaking what are existent are fields which can be as extensive as you like. But one thing I rather like is I have a belief that, and I started this idea as a teenager. I rejected the idea that history, for example, moved in straight lines. I didn't believe there was a linear progress. I thought, in fact, that what happened was there were cycles, but I wasn't happy with the idea that we just came back to the place we started from, in Eliot's famous formulation, and know it for the first time. In fact, I think we come back to something a bit like it, but further up. So it's rather like a spiral staircase in which you can see where you were at that point before, and you carry on, and then you can see, as you go up, you see more. And if you think of that image, I believe that, if you have to say there is one form that is intrinsic in the cosmos, I would say it is that of a spiral in that sense. And perhaps this is going too far, but if you image a spiral from the side, what you see is a sine wave. In other words, a waveform. If you image it down its axis, you see a circle, in other words, a particle. And it seems to be rather beautiful that these things are two different perspectives on something similar.
Have you come across David Bohm's ideas of the implicate and explicate orders?
Absolutely.
I just wondered what you thought of that. I remember when we were at Birkbeck, we actually saw an experiment which was performed where the cylinder was filled with glycerin, a very viscous fluid, and a little syringe was placed in, and a little ink dot was placed in it.
Yes.
And then a paddle was turned so that all the The glycerin was smeared out, and the dot disappeared. And then the
Yes,
astonishing thing was that as it
yes.
was turned back again, you wouldn't believe it, but the dot then reappeared
Reemerge.
out of that.
Yes,
Yes.
yes,
what's your view on the
yes.
that kind
Yes,
of
I
a
know about that,
paradigm?
and very much about his paradigm. Well, again, there's so much we could talk about there, but I think to come to the nub, I think that what I see both in in life and in the cosmos, animate or inanimate, is alternating patterns, which I think Bohm himself saw, of the implicit becoming explicate. In other words, what was infolded being outfolded. But then that thing having been outfolded, being further infolded again and reaching actually a new condition. So that there was a creative process of alternating outfolding and infolding. And in a way, I like to take this back to an image that is in Hegel that I found very striking, that when a bud unfolds into a flower, has that destroyed or of the bud? Absolutely not. It is the fulfillment of the bud, and all the stuff that is in the flower was there in the bud, and now you see it. But then that flower goes back into bud, which is the seed head, from which new life will come forth again. So there are these alternating patterns of closing in and unfolding. That rings a very strong bell with me. And when I read Goethe saying, dividing the united, uniting the divided is the whole work of nature, I thought, I mean, as I so often do with Goethe, it sounds so simple, but it contains volumes.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Um, we're coming to the end of our time, Ian.
Very,
But
I really say I've enjoyed this very much.
so have I. So have I. But let me ask you just one or two small questions to end with, if I may, and to bring us up to date in terms of our present society, which seems to me, and I might be wrong here, but it seems to be very much dominated by left hemisphere thinking, very logically, linearly, consistently laid out. And of course, from that, we've made a lot of progress in terms of science and the scientific method. But I just wonder, what do you think of the way in which society is therefore headed? Is there a left side bias, and does that cause us a problem or difficulty?
Yes, and I strongly do, and it's one of my most frequently debated points, or not so much debated, but largely accepted, I think. But I do argue this at the end of The Master and His Emissary and at the end of The Matter with Things. I think that it's interesting, all this stuff in terms of science and philosophy, but it's very important for us as a civilization that we see that this is leading us to ruin. And I'd just like to gloss, because people may say, oh, well, it's been very useful for science. It has indeed, but it also runs a risk, as it always does if it's taken too far, because we come back to the consistency versus creativity thing, that science needs to inhabit, as art does and life does, what's sometimes called the edge of chaos, but I think is better described as a balance, a harmony between rigidity and fluidity. And science can become too rigid and is at the moment saying no, can't be to all kinds of things. I'm glad to say it's moving on in biology. It's catching up with where physics was 100 years ago, very belatedly, having been incredibly pompous about how it's all scientific reductionism that matters. So there is that, but I do think in our society, yes, if you look across it, it bears so many stigmata of left hemisphere thought. It's dogmatic, it's black and white in its thinking, it rejects nuance, it rejects things that are embodied like skill and insight in favour of things that a machine might be able to churn out. I think it's manifested in the colossal neoplastic growth of bureaucracy in our world at the expense of the institutions the bureaucracies are there to serve. So once again, it's the emissary challenging the master and wanting to be the master. And the other is AI, in which the same thing can be seen to be happening. At the moment, AI is keeping its tongue very clean and sort of being very, yes, of course. Although sometimes, actually, it is hilariously dogmatic about things it knows nothing about and is completely wrong about. But anyway, so I think that AI and bureaucracy are expressions of it. But so I think the sort of dogmatic, ghastly social media world of the last 25 years with totalitarian, frankly, views that you cannot say something, or indeed you must say its opposite. And if you don't even say that opposite, you may be seen to be wanting, you might lose your job, you might be expelled, you might become a kind of untouchable because you dare to challenge what is frankly a very stupid left-leaning kind of way of looking at the world that really doesn't stand up. And one of the reasons I think they're so dogmatic about it is that they know that if they once entered into a discussion about it on rational and peaceful grounds, they would find that they were on a sticky wicket, as we say in this country.
Yes. Do you blame the left side brain domination for that intransigence and that lack of openness?
I definitely do. And there's a quality I attribute to the left hemisphere that I call stickiness, which is fairly self-explanatory, but it tends to hang on to something that it knows in the face of contrary evidence, and it takes a lot to shift it. It tends to, say, no, hier stehe ich kann nichts anders, but it perfectly well can something anders, and it's not prepared to do so. So there is always a difficulty in the left hemisphere thing that it becomes rigid, sclerotic, uncreative, anti-creative. Yes, I do blame it for that. And it's not, I want to say there's nothing wrong with the left hemisphere in itself. It is a very important tool. It is a very important emissary. It is not a good master. And Einstein said words exactly to that effect.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for an individual, maybe, who is concerned that maybe their own views are more dominated by one hemisphere than the other? I mean, is there any actions that they can take, any practices they can do in order to help balance or get a better balance of approach?
Well, the first thing is to have the insight that there is something missing. And when I talk in the subtitle of The Matter with Things of the Unmaking of the World, I think it's a good exercise to think what has been unmade, what have we lost from our world that people appear to have at other times. The trouble is that if we live in a culture that rejects its own culture as strongly as ours does, people grow up not really having a good rooting in the wonderful literature and history and philosophy of this culture. If they knew more about that, they would see what it was they were missing. So I think the first thing is to see what you're missing, because as a psychiatrist, I know it's no good telling people we'll do these things. It won't work. They have to see there's something missing here and I need to find a way of getting it back into my life. And I think the point then is not to think that necessarily I must have an action plan, but instead I must stop doing many of the things that are in my current action plan. So non-doing and unknowing may be much more intelligent than they sound. And in fact, that is Eastern Orthodox wisdom, really, that not doing and not knowing are the place where you actually find wisdom. That doesn't mean just being idle and sitting on the sofa doing nothing. It means actively opening yourself to possibilities that are excluded by your current way of thinking. And as I sometimes say, a gardener can't make a plant. A gardener has to take the possibility of a plant and encourage it or thwart it. And I think that's the way it is. You have to stop thwarting things happening in your consciousness, in your personal life, and take away the blocks and see what comes. It won't be done by an effort. It will be done because you have stood back. Having said that, it may sound a little mystical, but my answers would be mystical ones. If you really want a plan of action, it would be things like make time for mindfulness, which is simply stopping the chatter in your in your left hemisphere, which is going on all the time. Yes, I know, I've got it, I understand. No, stop all that and see what comes forth. And yes, prayer, which is maybe a very difficult thing to do, but there isn't, as it were, a technique. I think the thing is to make space and do, as I think the infant Samuel says, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. In other words, it's not about me saying. Prayer is not about me saying things. It's about me listening. And if you listen carefully, you will hear something. It may be difficult to hear to begin with, but the more you hear, the more you listen, and the more you listen, the more you hear. And something comes into being, rather like a faint image that's out of focus, and it comes gradually into focus, and you see what it was all along. So other practical things are, of course, to reform the curriculum at school, because I think schooling makes the future.
I was talking to the strictest head teacher in the country last week, and she shocked me, Catherine Birbelsing, and she shocked me by saying that they hardly teach any content in schools at all now. It's all about being friends with the pupils, and it's shocking.
Horrendous. I mean, not that it's bad for teachers to be friendly with their charges, but that can't be the whole of it. It's rather like modern parenting. People want the luxury of being the friends of their children, but if they do that, they let their children and society down. There need to be boundaries, and there need to be, yes, things that can't be done and can't be said, and so on. But on the other hand, that is not to say that parents, in fact, it's much better in that situation to have a proper adult loving relationship with your children. So, I mean, my teachers were on the whole friendly, but my goodness, there were rules, there were principles, there was respect, there were, and we had to learn things, whether we saw at the time why we were learning them or not.
Oh. Dr. Iain McGilchrist, thank you very much for talking with me today.
No, well, thank you very much, Philip.